Thank you very much for hosting me, and thank you to everybody for joining today. And I just want to begin by saying one word to acknowledge that this was originally scheduled to take place, I think, in mid-October, the end of October, something like that. And we postponed it because, of course, at that point, no one wanted to talk about anything except the war, and we believed, or we hoped, or we prayed that come March, that would all be behind us. And of course, it's not and still on our minds, and we still pray for the hostages and we pray for peace. I just want to acknowledge that to begin with. Um, we're going to talk about modern slavery. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put on a PowerPoint for you. And I really believe when we talk about human rights, it has to come through conversation and not through lecture or not through, it has to come through conversation and understanding different viewpoints. And really, please either raise a hand on Zoom or jump in with the audio if you need to. If I don't see you with the PowerPoint, if someone wants to make a comment or say something. I'm going to put here, I'm going to go to share screen. And we should be taking away. I'm going to keep it like this even so that here, I'm going to go to keep it like this. Okay. It says here, if God had not redeemed, I want to mention also this ties in, of course, to Passover because of how you start the slideshow, which I can't seem to do with the control bar here. Of course, ties into Passover because we say at Passover, if God had not redeemed us from Egypt, we would still today be slaves unto Pharaoh. And I want to mention also, I wrote a book called The Human Rights Haggadah, which tries to raise human rights issues as they come up in the context of the Passover story, not to advocate a particular viewpoint, but to acknowledge that people who are committed to human rights can have many different viewpoints or many different positions about all the different issues that come up, but to show that how so many human rights issues come up in the Passover story and how it can be a very fruitful or a very ideal time to begin to talk about and to learn about some of these issues. It's just how about I give some sources and some questions for discussion. Let's talk about this. If God hadn't redeemed us, we would still be slaves. And I think that I kind of thought when I would used to read this line, and many of us do, well, wait a second. You could have said that for a while, but there's no slaves today. I mean, are there still slaves? If God hadn't redeemed us from Egypt, wouldn't slavery have ended throughout the course of history as slavery was abolished? Or is this a line of the Haggadah that's antiquated and doesn't really make sense anymore? It's a question we're going to begin with. And I'll start here with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a famous document which was actually ratified or voted on by the United Nations General Assembly, which kind of lays out a very broad, sweeping vision of what human rights are, what they're supposed to be. And right at the start, Article 4, it says like this: no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. I think we all agree to that. And anybody that will come and say, oh, be a slave owner today. I mean, could you imagine anything more repulsive or more quickly reviled? But the issue is, has this solved the problem? And even though we all agree to this principle, is slavery really gone? So look over here. This is the International Labor Organization, which is probably the international organization most involved with what slavery would be. And they put, this is about 2 or 3 years ago, they put out a report called Global Estimates of Modern Slavery. We'll talk about what modern slavery means in just a minute. Forced labor and forced marriage. And I want to just read to you a little bit of what they found. They said, modern slavery, as defined for the purposes of the global estimates, is two things: forced labor and forced marriage. And today we're going to focus more on forced labor than forced marriage. Forced marriage is a very difficult topic. What you basically have is someone, usually a woman, who's being forced to perform domestic work, who's been tied to another man for the purpose of doing his bidding. Both refer to situations of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or cannot leave because of threats, violence, deception, abuse of power, other forms of coercion. We'll come back to that in a minute. So how much of this is going on according to the ILO? The scourge of modern slavery has been by no means been relegated to history. In 2021, this is what they say: 49.6 million people are in modern slavery on any given day. You'll see about half of those are considered to be forced labor and half are forced marriage. And this is the basis of the statistic that's often quoted. In absolute terms, there are more slaves today than any time in history, taking this 49.6 million number. And I'm just going to summarize what they put here on the rest of the page. They want you to understand this is not happening all in some faraway place or in one particular part of the world, but that modern slavery happens in every country, on every continent, and is widespread. Okay, what is modern slavery? I'm going to show a few more slides here, and I want to ask for a discussion here. Oh, pardon me, they put the definition that they give. It's a real difficult one right here under forced labor. It says forced labor under the ILO refers to all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty and for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. That's super confusing, I think, what they're talking about. I'll come back to that in one more minute. Just want to read to you one other definition of slavery, maybe a little bit more familiar, right here from the Rabbi, where he says like this. The Rambam says, from Hilchot Sfirut, he says like this: even if a worker began to work, he can quit even in the middle of the day. As it says, the children of Israel are slaves to me, not slaves unto slaves. I mean, this becomes kind of a definition of slavery according to the Rambam. If you can't quit, you're a slave. Why not? Because if you can't quit, then you've become a slave to a human master, whereas the only master we have that we can't quit on, is okay. Is there a difference between someone who can't quit and the ILO definition of a menace of a certain punishment? I'm not really sure if they're different or not, but let me ask you a question now to stop for a moment and ask. How could this possibly happen? Has anybody here, who here has a job or has ever had a job? Let's start there. Okay, lots of people have had a job. Have you ever had a job that you can't quit? Has someone here ever felt that they have a job that they're unable to quit? Now, let me just go back one second. It says the Rambam says that you can quit even in the middle of the day, meaning your right to quit is absolute. At any point that you decide to quit, you have the right to quit. Now, that might not be the right thing to do. That might be very problematic ethically. I mean, if your boss is counting on you or something and you just say in the middle of the day, I quit, but he needs workers in order to do his customs, that might be the wrong thing. But fundamentally, you have the right to. You certainly have the right to quit with appropriate notice. That's moral and all that. Has anyone here ever had a job where they felt they couldn't quit? No one. I take it nobody. How would this happen? Why would it be that someone can't quit?
Consequences.
Go ahead, yeah. Go ahead.
Potential consequences.
Elaborate. What do you mean by consequences? Elaborate on the consequences.
So,
What would they
for
be?
example, armed taskmasters who will inflict
so
corporal punishment.
taskmasters are stopping you from quitting. Okay. And that's for sure true. And we're going to see in a little bit maybe one sort of example of it. But I want to submit to you that is what we've kind of gotten away from with the Universal Declarations of Human Rights, for someone to come with whips and violence and chains or something like that. But what are other what do you mean by consequences? What could be other consequences of quitting that make it impossible to quit?
There's an answer in the chat.
Well, I can't see the chat from the screen. Tell me the chat. Go ahead. Tell me what it is or figure out how to get to it.
Emma says because they need money or insurance.
Okay, very good. That's a very plausible thing. So let's say the person can quit if they want to, but if they quit, they won't have the money to pay their bills. They'll become homeless. They won't be able to pay their rent. They won't be able to have medical insurance and all that. Do you think that that's a form of slavery then? If a person can't quit because of the personal financial consequences to them, is that a form of slavery? I mean, who thinks it is? Say so. I can't see that. If I can figure out how to see the chat, 1 second. And go back here. So I can see the chat over here. Tell me what you think. I got the chat. Or write in the chat. If someone cannot quit their job due to personal financial consequences, meaning I'm living day to day, hand to mouth, and if I quit, I won't be able to pay my rent, I won't be able to pay for gas. Why isn't that a form of slavery if not?
You'd have to do some sort of like analysis of what people's fundamental like rights are, like what people like should be able, like is housing one of those? And is that
Okay.
like dependent on
Yeah.
you? Yeah, I probably agree with Emma's analysis that probably not exactly slavery, but maybe something close to it.
The separate question is housing a human right? Is food a human right? That's another question that we could ask as well. I would submit to you that they're not slaves for a little bit of a separate reason, which is let's think from the perspective of the employer. So, does the employer necessarily even know the employee's financial position? How whether they're living hand to mouth, whether they do have savings to fall back upon, whether they have other, I don't, there might not be something that the employer knows. Meaning, the employer might not be exploiting that per se in order to get the employee to do things. I don't know. I just put in a job ad, and this person came, and I hired them, and the fact that they desperately need this money and can't afford to quit. Well, I didn't exploit that. I didn't do it. I didn't create that circumstance. I'm not sure you can blame me for being a slave owner or some of that for creating a situation of modern slavery. Then I'm just doing my thing. Okay. Any other comments or thoughts on that question? Right. So I want to move on and show you. We're going to show you two examples here. I want to show two examples of modern slavery. The first one connected to the United States, specifically to show how this can happen right here at home in the United States, and to look at some of the ways that a person can be put into a job that they absolutely cannot quit. Let me go back to here to the share screen and see if I can go down the screen. I want to take a look here. It's called the H-2A Temporary Agricultural Workers Program in the United States. And I don't want to get all technical about H2 or H1 or the different kinds of visa programs that we have. For our purposes, H1, H2, H2A, it kind of all amounts to the same sort of thing. This is a program. This is right now from the United States government a website. It allows U.S. employers or U.S. agents to bring in foreigners who wouldn't ordinarily be able to. So look who qualifies. The petitioner, meaning a United States employer, has to offer a job that is temporary or seasonal in nature. In this context, it's usually agricultural. We need people to harvest, we need people to plant. It could also be working at a summer camp, things like that. Demonstrate that there are not enough U.S. workers willing to do it, which happens all the time. You can't find U.S. workers willing to work in harvesting crops and all that kind of stuff. You have to show that it won't adversely affect the wages and working conditions of U.S. workers and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So at first, does this sound like a good idea? Almost. I mean, we don't have U.S. workers to do a job that is vital and has to be done. So it's a temporary job. So we offer to bring in guest workers who want to do this, who will do a temporary job that we can't find United States citizens to do. Now, you might think, what if you pay them low wages? What if there's problems? So look at this. Here, I just switched to a screenshot from the H-1B, but it's the same kind of thing again. These are the guarantees that we give to people that are on these visas, on this H-1, H-2 things. You have to be paid the same pay that you're going to pay a United States citizen, right? You have to be paid for non-productive time. You have to get the same fringe benefits as U.S. employees. Your employer may not require you to pay any part of the filing fee or meaning any of the legal fees that an employer needs to get set up for this visa. So to offer this visa, they have to bear, and they can't impose it on you. Come back to that in a minute. And your employer must provide you with working conditions on the same basis and criteria as provided similarly employed U.S. workers, hours, shifts, vacations, and safety, and all that kind of stuff. So what do you think? Is it going to work? I mean, would you feel comfortable letting your family member, let's say, go to the United States to work on one of these visas? They're going to get the same salary as a U.S. employee, the same fringe benefits, the same working conditions as a U.S. citizen. Is this a good deal for them? Does it sound okay? If anyone has a comment in the chat, please read it. I want to show you here a simple Google search. I just did a search on Google just for H2 visa, just to show you how widespread this is. When I Googled H2 visa, here's what you get. The new American slavery. Latest slavery indictments expose exploitative nature of the H2 visa. Close to slavery, the guest worker programs in the United States. H2 visa, modern slavery, close to slavery again from the Southern Poverty Law Center. Here's my question. What's going on? What's going wrong? We just said these are people that are needed to fill vital jobs in the United States, vital seasonal jobs that have to be done that U.S. workers don't want to do. We've guaranteed them comparable wages, comparable working conditions, and all that kind of stuff. We're not burdening them with the legal fees associated with this visa. Where did this all going wrong then? What's the problem here? Why are we having problems? Well, we'll take a look. I'm going to show you one article here, and this is the one on BuzzFeed. I wanted just to show you that previous Google search just to show you this is not an outlier, not the only one. Here's their story. The new American slavery, invited to the U.S., foreign workers find a nightmare. It's going to try to explain to us or show us what goes wrong on this. It says the H2 visa program invites foreign workers to do some of the most menial labor in America. Then it leaves them at the mercy of their employers. Thousands of these workers have been abused, deprived of their fair pay, imprisoned, starved, beaten, raped, threatened with deportation if they dare complain. I want us to wonder, how did this happen? Why are they being imprisoned, starved, beaten, and raped if it says they're getting the same working conditions as an American worker? Okay. Travis Manuel and his brother Trey, I'm reading just a little bit of the story. It says they were shopping at Walmart near his rural town when they met two Mexican women who struck them as sweet, using a few words of Spanish. They asked the two women out for a double date. Okay, hold on. Scrolling down. As soon as they got in the car, the women began saying something like the patron was angry. When he was trying to find out what they meant, this truck was following them. They started to try to lose the truck, but then they saw a police car, right? Going down. I said, we're going to flag down the cop for help because this truck is following them. But the cop pulled us over, lights on, told us not to get out of the vehicle. And then he started talking to the guy in the pickup truck. Then the officer asked Trey and his brother for an ID. And then the women started to cry. Travis tried to reassure them they weren't doing anything wrong and they were in the United States. Well, no. The man in the truck was the woman's boss, a prominent farmer in the heart of Cajun country. And that these two women were two of his girls. And the cops are going to have to scare the girls. The police brought the women, who were both in their 20s, to the station house. They couldn't leave the farm without permission, they're told, or they're going to wind up dead. Then there's the whole thing where pantomiming, cutting their throats and threatening them with a taser, and they could be deported. And then they were released to for the 15-minute drive to the compound, a place where the women and the Mexican government say workers were stripped of their passports and assigned to sleep in a filthy, foul-smelling trailer infested with insects and mice. They claimed that the other women were imprisoned, forced to work for a little pay, and frequently harassed by West, who demands that their breasts, having sex with them is the only way out of poverty. I'm just going to read a little bit more here. The key point, these women were not undocumented immigrants working off the books. They were in the United States legally as part of a government program that allows employers to import foreign labor for jobs they say Americans won't take, but also allows the companies to control almost every aspect of their employees' lives. And it goes on to talk more about it. They're coming to clean in the resorts and pick fruit, cut lawns, golf courses, and all that kind of stuff. Do we get any sense here yet of how this happens? Why this is going on? How just in that little bit of a story, do we get any sense of how we went from saying they're filling vital jobs, we're giving them all these guarantees, the same workplace guarantees in terms of pay, in terms of conditions as a regular American citizen, and then we got to this case where they're being beaten and imprisoned and kept in squalid conditions. Why is that happening? Do you have any sense in the story how we got to that? What's the problem here? What are the many problems? Anyone you want to raise a hand or in the chat?
Enforcement?
Beg your pardon, enforcement of what? Say more.
I don't know. I guess like enforcement of United States law.
So that one problem is that the United States government is failing to enforce the laws. Good point. Okay, I'll come back to that in just a bit. More enforcement might potentially help. But how are they getting away with this? Meaning, why don't the women just leave? Why do these workers come to begin with, and why don't they leave? Why don't they flee? Why can't they just go get another job? So, what would be their first obstacle if they would try to leave their job? Anybody? Let's understand something. They came to the United States on this visa. If they leave their job, if they say they don't want to work for this guy anymore, what's the first thing that happens to them is that they lose their legal rights to be in the United States. Okay? What can be the effect of that then? Then immediately, if they stop working for this guy, they become illegally present in the United States and subject to deportation. Well, that's a big problem. Why could that be a problem? I mean, first of all, what drove them to take this job in America to begin with? Most likely, there's something in their home country that they are fleeing that they don't want to go back to. It could be violence, it could be on a personal level, it could be an abusive spouse, an abusive relationship, an abusive family relationship. It could be an unstable political situation. They could be living in a violent place that they need to escape from. They could be escaping abject poverty or whatever else that is. Meaning going home to them is obviously the last thing that they want to happen to them. And that's what it means if they quit. Meaning, if I quit my job and I'm a US citizen, I can just go look for another job. And even if I have a rather low level job, let's say I have a low paying job and I have a low level of skills, I can go look for, if I want to quit my job on a farm, I can go get a job on another farm or something like that. I can go get a job in fast food or something like that. But not if I'm here on an H-2 visa. I cannot go and apply for any other job. I have to leave the country first because those visas are not transferable. That means because I've come to the United States on this visa, I am completely tied to my employer, and my employer effectively cannot just fire me. My employer can kick me out of the country. That's the first thing. So the consequences of quitting can be devastating to them, number one. What else? Who has their passport? In many of these cases, the employer has their passport, meaning for all kinds of reasons. The employer may say, I'm going to keep your passport for safekeeping. Like I have a safe and you don't want your passport in your dorm room or something like that. That means that if they want to quit, they can't just leave. They have to go and beg the employer for their passport back, right? That can be either uncomfortable or impossible to get it back. That's number two. And the employer hasn't broken a law. There's no law that says that if the employees voluntarily wanted you to keep their passports in your safe, you can't do it. But the result is that then they have to beg you for permission to leave. That's another one. What's another terrible consequence? Another very difficult consequence people on this visa might face if they leave. So I want to give people a chance to chime in or to respond if you want to, in the chat or audio. Remember, it said in the regulations that the employer cannot burden the employee coming into the country on a visa with the legal costs of attaining the right to issue those visas and all the applications you have to do to the United States government, all that kind of stuff. They can't be burdened with those costs. The employer has to bear it. But are there other costs that the employee may need to bear? What if that employee spent their life savings or all their savings, or for that matter, mortgaged their house, sold off all their property, pawned off all their property in order to get hooked up with this job? In terms of transportation, in terms of contacting a recruiter, in terms of whatever they need to do. And now they're in a position where they're fleeing violence, they're fleeing instability, they're fleeing poverty, and they've sold off or pawned or whatever everything that they own and used all of their last savings in order to have this opportunity. They're giving up everything if they quit. And because of that, they're very, very, very unlikely to quit. It's almost impossible for them, right? I mean, what about their food and housing while they are at the job? Who owns that? I mean, they may be in housing, they may be being fed or getting their food, their food and housing from their employer. And the employer is allowed to charge them for that via payroll deduction. So you may have a situation where they haven't even gotten paid yet. They haven't even gotten any pay yet because their initial pay is all deductions. Is all deductions to pay for a loan, let's say, to cover their transportation to the U.S., to cover whatever they needed to buy in order to do the job. So they may be absolutely penniless, literally penniless. And here becomes the issue. This is what I want to highlight here. When you have a situation where the employee is completely desperate, penniless, to lose this job would be the biggest tragedy that could happen to them in their life. Where you have an imbalance of power that is so great. I mean, whereas the employer is an upstanding member of the community, he's friends with the cops, he's in a bowling league with the cops, he's lived there his whole life. There's tons. He's wealthy, he has lawyers, whatever it is. There's he has all kinds of resources, and he has more employees, tons of employees. The imbalance of power is so unfathomably great that abuse is unstoppable. I don't want to say inevitable because we have to remember that plenty of employees do have good experiences on these visas. The employer does not have to abuse the employees, and of course, many don't. It's up to the employer and their level of conscientiousness and ethics and responsibility. It's not inevitable that abuse will. It's not inevitable that any specific instance will result in abuse. But when you create a situation where there is such a vast imbalance of power, it is inevitable there is going to be abuse in some of those situations because the conditions are so ripe for it, right? So, Eliezer, you talked about enforcement. What kind of enforcement would we need here to solve this?
You need some sort of enforcement which understands that there is a power difference created by this system, and it is the responsibility of the government to make sure that uh, people aren't taken advantage of. And the way that you do that is through some sort of, I don't know, yeah, law enforcement, or maybe the police is not the right the right way of doing it, but
Inspections, labor
you need,
inspections.
yeah, you need to create some way of evening out that power imbalance.
I want to say, I want to kind of use this as two different things. One is labor inspections, and one is evening out the power balance. Any other thoughts about things we can do here that the government can do? Just want to hear if anybody wants to elaborate on what you just said. Any other comments there? Inspections. What kind of inspections are going to work? Are inspections going to work? How can inspections work? How can the government help here? Any other thoughts or comments? So here's the issue. If you look at that story that we just read in that BuzzFeed article, there was a cop in that story. And what did the cop do? It didn't do anything to help these women, you know? And I think that that's the issue is you can say we need inspectors, we need labor inspectors, we need the police to come, but here's the issue. Let's say a cop or let's say a labor inspector would come to the facility where these women are working. Are these women likely to be open and honest with the inspector when they are so vulnerable to retaliation, to retaliatory firing, to having their wages, whatever, to retaliatory punishments? It's really hard to imagine, are there enough inspectors in the world? A lot of times these types of people are working in far-flung places, out in the fields somewhere. They're traveling. Some of these jobs are traveling jobs, carnival jobs. They're rotating from place to place. It's really, really hard to get those inspectors, get enough inspectors out there all the time. Even if the inspector comes, it's very hard to imagine that the people are going to feel comfortable being open and honest with the inspector, with they're so vulnerable to retaliation. It's hard to imagine that's going to work. Number three, the employer. The workers don't know their rights. They probably don't even speak English. They're not going to be able to, they're not going to be able to communicate. They don't know their rights. They don't know the legal jargon, whereas the employer does. The employer has lawyers. The employer knows the rights. They know all that kind of stuff. The employer may have personal relations with the inspectors. The employer could be a campaign donor to the whoever. Meaning it's really, really hard to see how inspections are going to help to solve this. And I would suggest to you that the key problem here is the tremendous imbalance of power, kind of similar to what we see in prisons. When you talk about, trying to the rights of the prisoners, okay, you can talk about the rights of the prisoners. When you have such a tremendous imbalance of power between the guards and the prisoners, abuse is very, very difficult to stop, and almost the same kind of situation here. And I would suggest that any kind of reform that we would do in this area needs to be focused at targeting, first of all, the imbalance of power, meaning that making laws that they have to have access to their passports at all times, and that they have to have funds to travel back to their country available to them. You can't leave them penniless at any time, things like that. But it's very, very hard to engineer a program like this. It's not going to feature abuse when abuse is so likely when you have this inevitable gap in power. Okay, let's take a look at one other thing. I want to show you one other instance like this. Hang on. This is going to be farther afield. This is going to be in Thailand. And it shows up in the United States, not not because the act is in the United States, but the products show up in the United States. Hang on a second. Let me go to the Thai fishing industry, which is known around the world as one of the best. And this is a story. This man here wrote a beautiful sort of illustrated book telling the story of what happened to him after he escaped here. A survivor's graphic memoir that reveals horrific exploitation and violence on the high seas and the shame of the world's complicity. Just read a little bit here. In 2006, a young Cambodian sculptor, Ivana Kaprum, left his village to look for laboring. He needed to earn enough money to pay for his wife's impending hospital stay to give birth to their child. He intended to stay away for 2 months. He wouldn't see his wife again for 5 years. After a middleman on the Thai-Cambodian border promised he could earn a lot of money drying fish, Frum was sold into slave labor, sent to sea on a fishing trawler. He was forced to work around the clock and through storms, allowed a maximum 2 hours sleep by day and 2 hours at night. Violence happened on the boat every day for the next 4 years as a way of keeping those enslaved in line, he tells to a translator. He says people would disappear off the boats without warning and were assumed to have been killed and thrown into the sea. One night he saw one Thai worker cut another man's head off with a cleaver, not to be too graphic. He writes about and explicitly draws these horrific experiences in his new graphic memoirs. I've read, it's a beautiful book to see the dead eye in the deep blue sea. The story includes his experience of jumping ship to attempt to swim to his escape, only to be sold by his rescuers into slavery on a palm oil plantation on the coast. Come back to that too in a minute. And then he was rescued by a human rights organization again. There are many slaves who die in the ocean. Their children don't know where they have gone. If we don't share these stories, the world doesn't know. The rest of the world is implicated in this slavery. Some of the trash fish caught by enforced labor on these boats gets used as pet food sold in supermarkets, as well as in cheap protein for the prawn farming. A lot of this is cat food and all that kind of stuff. He's going to go on to talk more about how they're tricked onto the boats, they're lied to about what is in store for them, and then how they are abused on these boats. Just another couple of words about it. Just I read his memoir too. Is what can happen to them is they have little smaller fishing boats, and if you wonder how they can stay at sea for so long, they have what they call mother boats. And these little fishing boats dock every once in a while to a mother boat where they transfer all the fish that they caught and they take on supplies. And these fishing boats never come to shore, never. And that's how they're essentially kept captive on these fishing boats. And he talks in his the book he wrote, his picture book, about how one time the boat actually came to shore for maintenance. So you have to eventually do maintenance on the boat. And they actually dropped their workers off on an abandoned island so they couldn't run away when they took the boat to get maintenance and tried to get them back again off the island. It's that extreme. Okay. What I want to ask here, the key question is like this. Obviously, the people most immediately at fault for doing this are the captains. What they're doing is despicable. It's outrageous. It's horrific. It's disgusting, and they should be punished. But rather than just stop there, I want to ask again, what is allowing this to happen? Meaning, why is it that someone is allowed to take impoverished people fleeing from Cambodia, lie to them about lie to them and trick them into going on a fishing boat where they're told it's going to be 2 months and they're going to get paid and they're going to go back to Cambodia with all this money, lie to them and put them on a boat where they're going to be trapped, and keep them on this boat for years in horrific conditions. Why are they able to do that? Another way of asking that question is, who is responsible for stopping this? Besides the people involved, I'm not talking about, obviously we're going to condemn the boat captain with every condemnation we can, but beyond that, who is responsible for putting a stop to this? Someone speak up or a chat or raise a hand.
I mean, personally, this is something I always struggle with. Like, you hear about these things, and I don't know what I can do. And I ask myself that all the time whenever I hear about these injustices. Like, who,
Okay, Isaac, are you responsible for stopping this? Let's start
right?
there. You.
No, yes, but it's just, I don't know where we could start.
Who is? Who could be responsible? Name a candidate for who could be responsible for putting a stop to this. I mean, let's say we wanted to take political action. We wanted to campaign politically on their behalf. Who are we going to campaign to? Who's not doing their job? Who?
Oh, yeah. Governmental
Name
officials,
someone.
very helpful.
Who? You just said environmental officials?
Well, governmental.
Governmental officials. Tell me the government. Which?
Ours would be a good start.
The
The
United
US.
States. Okay, but here's what's going to happen. The United States government, by the way, why did you pick the US government? I saw Emma said the country in which it is occurring. Well, these are Thai fishing boats. Now, I wanted to show you the complexity and the problem. Let's say you complain to the government of Thailand, because what seems to be happening is that these fishing boats are transferring their fish to a mother boat. The mother boat is eventually making its way back to Thailand, where the fish are processed and exported from Thailand. The problem is the government of Thailand has some excuses. They're going to say as follows. Number one, these fishing boats operate primarily in international waters. Okay. And we are not responsible for policing international waters. Problem. And number two, they're going to tell you that now these boats are way, way out at sea. International waters are not. I don't know the exact details of Thailand and their makeup of their navy, but look, they're whatever they have as a coast guard that's way, way out there. You're talking about many, many miles away from shore. The Navy, their naval ships are not designed to enforce labor standards. They don't have the knowledge, the expertise, or the ability to do that. They're a Navy. They battle other navies. And their little Coast Guard ships are not going to be able to go out anywhere into the open ocean, and certainly not into international waters to track down these people. So the government of Thailand said, we have nothing we can do. What about the United States government? Should the United States government be involved here? Or some other government?
Embargoes?
Well, say what you mean. What do you mean? Embargo who?
Like embargo Thailand? Part of the reason why the problem doesn't get solved is because there's a monetary incentive for it to remain unsolved. So hypothetically, there could be a situation where you could create a monetary incentive that is strong enough that, like people will stop fishing if they can't sell their fish, right? Again, obviously, I guess I can imagine complicating this by saying someone else is going to buy that fish than the US. But
when you say embargo, do you mean like a boycott or something like that, maybe?
yeah, like a boycott on no more fish from Thailand.
Who's going to boycott? Who's going to do the boycott? I mean, seriously, who? You, me?
The U.S. There are certain things that we have.
Well, see, this is where you're getting to an issue, a little bit of a broad brush. I mean, not to import anything at all from Thailand might be a little bit too extreme. And then you'd have to have some way of figuring out which are the fish that are caught with slave labor. And this is extremely difficult because what happens is, yeah, go ahead.
You wouldn't have to, right? You could just say no fish from Thailand, right? And like it's the Thai government's responsibility now to figure out some solution to its fishing system. Get the Coast Guard out further, teach them how to enforce these rules.
I mean, again, the Thailand is going to argue, why are you picking on us? They're in international waters. The people that they're victimizing are Cambodian. They can go to other ports too. Or, I thought it was the United States. If you ask the United States government, they're going to say, well, hold on, this is halfway around the world. Since when are we the world's policeman? Why are we doing this? Why is our Navy or our Coast Guard or whatever running halfway around the world? So you might say, I think it's kind of the direction you were going there, is maybe the purchasers, maybe let's say this is being used in cat food, or it's being used in, they call it the prawns, in shrimp farming or whatever it is. So whoever is sourcing ingredients for cat food, that company, Purina, whatever it is, that company should take responsibility for making sure that the materials the fish that they're acquiring has not been purchased through slave labor. That's a possibility. Okay. As you already began to say, that what are some of the problems of putting a company, a Western company, in charge of enforcing this? First of all, they're going to tell you, we have no means of knowing where the fish that we're buying comes from. What happens is that these fishing boats with the slaves on them, they collect fish. Their fish is put in aggregated with more fish from other boats on a mothership. It goes into a port where it's aggregated with even more fish that were caught in other places and other ways. And we don't know what we're buying. We just don't know. How can you ask us? We're a for-profit business operating on the New York Stock Exchange in the United States. We don't we don't have the resources or the ability, and we don't feel it's our responsibility to enforce labor standards halfway around the world again. And we don't know where all this stuff is coming. A separate issue is, you might argue, why should we be in charge of enforcing labor standards? Purina or something like that. And then you get into a question, say, oh, this is standing up for human rights against slavery. You run into a question of Western bias, or one country's bias over another. Are they coming as a Western country to impose Western values about how employees ought to be treated on other countries, or what's going on here? Doesn't that really need to come from the Cambodians or come from the Thai? Because the trick is, if you say, okay, Korea says, no, we can't have any slavery going on here in our supply chain, fine. Now, everybody, I think, would agree that what we just read about, is horrific abuse being kept for years on a ship. But then, if that's not, if you're going to say we can't have people being kept for years, so how many days can we keep them on a ship without being a vacation on shore? 1 month, 1 week, 2 months. After 2 months on a ship, they get 2 weeks on shore, 1 week on shore. What's the story here? Who's going to be making all those decisions about labor? Who's going to be making all those decisions again? And it shouldn't be, a Western company. It needs to come from those governments. And they might have their own view as to what is acceptable, what is not. So Purina is going to say, you can't put us in charge, and also, well, Purina is only going to be, you might say, who's responsible? So Isaac, I said, maybe you, maybe me, maybe the end consumer has to be the one to speak up first. But again, what's the problem with that? And consumers, they don't necessarily have the knowledge. They don't necessarily, it's not something that's on their mind. They're at Walmart buying food, and asking a shopper to get involved and worrying about the supply chain for all of the items they're purchasing at the supermarket. It may not be realistic even to ask them that. One other question I want to ask about this. If we wanted to have enforcement, actual enforcement, what would if you wanted, let's say you wanted to have an organization that would do this enforcement, what would that organization need to look like? What would it have? What would it have to have? Someone said the United Nations. Good, good. Let's take that as an example. So let's say we wanted to create an international organization, maybe something under the auspices of the ILO, under the auspices of the UN. Forget their whole bureaucracy, where it would be. But what would that organization need in order to enforce anti-slavery regulations in the open ocean? What would it need to have? I mean, both logistically, both legally, both.
So I believe they'd have to have, I mean, as Emma said before, a lot of governmental support, but at the same time, I'm pretty sure there was a policy to ban imports from Uyghur labor camps, and
Sure.
companies have found their way.
Hang on. So when you say government support, I want to take that at the end, but what specifically do they need legal authority? What legal authority would this organization have to have? And it would have to have the authority to stop a boat anywhere in international water, anywhere in the world. This organization that's supposed to fight slavery on the high seas would have to have the authority, the legal authority, to stop a ship anywhere in the world, both in international waters and probably in the waters of a country, or the ships would just straddle the line and run back and forth in order to escape, right? They would have to be able to stop any ship anywhere in the world whenever they want to. Number one, the legal authority to do that. Number two, they're going to need some weapons. I mean, because on the ship, they say, hello, we want your ship, stop fishing right now. We want to board your ship and inspect you and talk to all your crew. Well, they're going to say, jump in the lake, however they want to phrase that. They're going to have some power. They're going to need weapons. They're going to need threats. If you dare run away and defy us, we're going to catch you, whatever, a police car. If you try to run away from the police car, well, there's consequences to that. They're going to have a way of punishing people who try to defy them. Weapons. They're going to need jails. They're going to need all that kind of stuff. I mean, what you said, when you said international backing, this is what I'm saying. This theoretical international organization would have to have everything the international organizations say don't have, because governments hate to give power to the government. Say, oh, you want to create an international organization that can come into my territorial waters and stop boats that are being operated by my citizens whenever they feel like it, and subject citizens of our country in our own country's waters to international law and take them away to an international court and an international prison. Forget it. You're impinging on our sovereignty. And this is the real problem. These Thai fishing boat captains are exploiting the fact that our world is so divided and so hesitant to create this international type of authority that by just roaming around on the ocean, they can get away with whatever they want. And that's one of the things which is causing this. There's no simple solution to that. But I'm saying I want to point out how difficult a problem this is to solve. Without taking responsibility, obviously the captains, these people that are caught, should be put in prison, the captains, but vigilante justice, okay, And another thing, just to point out, when you talk about, one more thing I'll say about this, the people on the Thai fishing boat, not only do they not run away because they physically can't, because they're on a ship, or they're on an island. This guy in his book, he writes that he did escape at one point. And when he escaped, he was then found to be an illegal alien, and he was imprisoned again for escaping. I mean, the situation is so tragic and so dire. He's penniless, and then he's arrested because he escaped, because he'd entered the country illegally. So okay, I want to move a little more time. I want to move ahead and show you one other slide here. And can you see my screen here? No. So I go back to share. Let me go back to share screen. I want to show you, this is from the ILO. And I want to show you here, steps to ending modern slavery produced by the International Labor Organization. And here are the steps that they give. You can see the screen? I can't tell if you can or can't see it.
Yes.
Okay. And I hope that these make sense in the context of what we talked about. Number one, extend basic income security to all workers so they will be able to say no to jobs that are abusive and quit jobs that become so. Why is this important? Again, you can say that people have the right to quit whenever they want. Legally, they have the right to quit, but if the consequences of quitting are so dire, in terms of what we talked about before, I won't be able to pay the rent if I quit, I'm living hand to mouth if I quit. If people have basic security, some kind of social security or some kind of unemployment benefits or some kind of basic income guarantee, so that they need to quit, they can rely on unemployment benefits and social security, they will be able to protect themselves from exploitative and abusive job positions or something like that. That's the first thing, to give people the ability to protect themselves. And the point to understand is that something like unemployment insurance itself can be the number one guardrail against slavery. Because in the extreme, if people don't have it, they allow themselves, so they can be exploited like slaves. Number two, extend collective bargaining to all workers, including those in the informal economy. This way, they will be able to advocate themselves for secure and decent work. And this is very, very important because the balance of power we talked about is the imbalance is so extreme between the worker and the employer. One thing that can help is simply allowing the employees to unionize. And then the employer who can basically, if fire at will, or for that matter, kill some of the employees, whatever it is, just toss them out at will. Suddenly, the employer is no longer beholden. Suddenly, the employer has to worry about all his employees quitting or losing them or going out on strike, and it can lead to better working conditions. What's very important also is collective bargaining allows people to advocate for themselves instead of having an outsider advocate on their behalf, which is a very powerful thing. You know, I don't know what the situation is like. I'm not on a farm. I'm not on a fishing boat. Who am I to talk? Who am I to say? I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know what people in that situation really, really need. They know themselves, but if they have collective bargaining, if they're allowed to unionize something like that, then they can advocate for their own priorities and speak up. It gives them more of a voice in their own setting. Number three is stop fraudulent recruitment. Traffickers often entice people to leave their country by promising a good job somewhere else. And when the workers are vulnerable and indebted in a foreign country, trap them in poor conditions instead. Meaning, why do people even go? Is that there's these false promises. The state of California was doing this actually a couple of years ago. They were having a problem. The problem is the conditions that people are in the fields. And people are coming from Central America, from Mexico, to work in the fields in California. And California was actually paying for ads back in the places where these people are coming from. It's just the ads were just photos showing them the conditions that await them if they come. Meaning that these lies, people are desperate, they're willing to believe things that are not going to be the truth. They're willing to believe in a false hope, and just trying to stop that, to combat that with information, can already be a step. A couple more. Expand government labor inspections into the informal economy, so more places where modern slavery is prevalent will be included. We talked about labor inspections before. For example, domestic help, agriculture, and fishing boats are all places where modern slavery may be common, but governments currently struggle to inspect. And domestic help, remember, also people working just in a house as a nanny or as a maid or an au pair, something like that. The problem is there's a tremendous imbalance of power, number one, and it's very, very hard to have government inspections. You know, government can inspect a factory or something like that. It's kind of a sitting target for the government if it has inspectors and all that kind of stuff. But for the government to go into people's houses to see what's going on, agriculture where people are frequently moving around from one place to another, obviously fishing boats, whatever it means. But the idea being that the more we can try to have inspectors go to these, it's hard. It's very resource intensive. You know, you're having an inspector go to a far-flung place or whatever it is. But trying to get more inspections and more into the informal economies. Informal economy meaning labor in homes or in unusual places, or where you have a very small number of employees. You know, it's one thing if you have 1,000 people working in a factory, but just one or two people working in a home, to try to do that as well. And then the last one here is extend special protections to migrants and victims of war and natural disasters, as these groups are especially prone to modern slavery. And this is really a key point to remember, is, you know, someone who is in their own country, where they have the rights of a citizen, where they know more or less what their rights are, where they likely speak the language, where they likely have a network of friends and connections, are very unlikely to be exploited as slaves. They have a lot of reasons why, a lot of protections why they won't be exploited as slaves. But once someone leaves their country of citizenship and are in a foreign country where they become vulnerable suddenly to deportation and so forth, when they're in a foreign country where they don't speak the language, where they don't have a network, a social or family network, where they don't have rights, they don't have the same rights as citizens, they may have less legal rights, where they don't know what their legal rights are, then, and as people, why would that happen? Usually when they're fleeing poverty, or they're fleeing war, or they're fleeing a natural disaster, those are the people that are especially prone to modern slavery. And these are the places that we most have to look. Okay, any thoughts or comments so far?
The suggestions make sense, but they still suffer from the problem of enforcement, right?
Sure, that's for sure true. The point I want to make is, the real point I want to make with these suggestions is, of course, our first reaction when we read these stories is to want to prosecute the individuals. The fishing boat captain, the guy who's keeping all these women in squalid conditions and abusing them. The point I want to make is that, of course, we should do that. I'm not saying that we shouldn't prosecute these individuals, but if we want to address the problem, we have to look at the root causes, which are much broader. And to say we've created a system of lack of protections, of inequalities, of power imbalances that make it prone for abuse. And these are very systemic changes which are necessary to combat modern slavery. I'm not saying that these are easy to do. I mean, look at special protection to migrants and victims of war and natural disasters. These types of migrants, victims of war and natural disasters, some of the most neediest people on the planet, some of the people with the least amount of resources, least amount of money, least amount of power on the planet, but they're human beings too, and they have human rights just like everybody else and need this type of special protection, so that's all I'm saying is to look where these abuses, whenever you see people that are powerless and they're outside of their country of citizenship is where you're likely to see abuses, and that's where we have to look, Right, I think we just have a couple minutes. I just want to end with one more slide here. 1 second, I'm not even able to show it because I'm not on the right page. Anyway, I was going to just show you the Human Rights Haggadah. I can do it even with the I could do it even with the without this. And this is going to see here on the thing. So I put together a Haggadah for Pesach. It's called the Human Rights Haggadah. And what it does is it brings up human rights questions that come up in the Passover. So, for example, this is what we talked about today: slavery. What is slavery today? But also other issues. So, for example, just looking, we say, all who are hungry, let them come and eat. All who are needy, let them join our celebration. Is that a statement of human rights or is it a statement of charity? Do we consider food and shelter to be human rights? We talk about here slavery. It says that the wicked son had been there, he wouldn't have been redeemed. Does that mean that we can leave the wicked in slavery? What do we say about the human rights or conditions that we have to hold people in prisons and so reparations says that the Israelites came out with great wealth, which the rabbis understood to be compensation for slavery. So what do we say about reparations for slavery and other human rights abuses? When is that helpful, and when does it actually create further injustice? All kinds of things like that. So all the war crimes it gets into here, even in the Haggadah, when we talk about the 10 plagues, how would we understand that? So all these types of issues are in the human rights Haggadah, and just with the idea being just to raise questions, to give a little bit of just to raise questions, to give a little bit of sources for discussion, and then to enable people to discuss at the Seder, recognizing that a commitment to human rights values doesn't mean that we'll have any one particular political or social action position. There's many different views that we could take, many different competing values that have to be weighed, but just to try to weigh to raise those issues at the Seder. I'm going to put into the chat here the website, HR Haggadah. If you go to that website, you can see a place to order Haggadot, and also I have a blog there to talk about issues as well. Okay, with that, I see it's already exactly 1, so I'm going to close. And Eddie, are you there?
I'm here. I'll be quick.
Hi.
Yeah. But thank you so much for teaching us so much. Very informative, eye-opening, and very sad. But we appreciate your time.
Topic. It is a heavy topic, and it's a heavy topic, but sorry, thank you for having me. I hope we learned a little bit. I hope we have a few things to discuss, and I hope it opens just a little bit of thinking about some of the systemic issues that we face, So.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.
All right.